Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Naina Harawa. I'm an associate professor at UCLA, and I'm the co-director for the Resource Centers for Minority Aging Research. I just noticed there was an arrow on our title slide, but we wanted to welcome you to our webinar series. And we're going to be focusing today on incorporating conceptual models into your research proposals with a presentation by Clemma Muller. We're very glad to have her with us today. And I just wanted to start by giving you some background on the RICMAR program itself. This particular webinar is part of a NIA-funded research initiative. RICMAR stands for Resource Centers for Minority Aging Research. The program was begun in 1997 with a mission to build infrastructure to improve the health and well-being of elder diverse populations by reducing health disparities. And there's two specific kind of objectives to reach that mission, and one of them involves creating research infrastructure by mentoring sustained research careers focused on health of minority elders. And then the second aspect is enhancing the diversity of the professional workforce conducting research on the health of older persons. And incorporated in all of that are efforts to improve the research that's done in minority elders, as well as people's chances of getting funded to do this research. If you want to know more about our program, you can email us at the address provided, and further on you'll also see our website address. So you have a little bit more information there. I think some of these got repeated, so I will keep going. As I indicated, this is part of a series of webinars that we will be conducting, and they're conducted approximately quarterly. We don't have the next date set, but if you email us at bricmar.ucla.edu, we will add you to our listserv so you'll know when our next webinar is happening, or you can also check back on our website. And we also plan to archive this particular webinar on that website as well, so you can go back and see the recording and the slides. So as I said, I really want to welcome Clemma Muller, who will be your faculty for today. She's an assistant research professor at Washington State University. She comes to us from the Native Elder Research Center, and she's a formally trained biostatistician and epidemiologist who's been writing grants for over 15 years and has worked to support many junior investigators in developing their research proposals across a wide range of funding mechanisms and research topics. And a lot of, well, at least part of that work is what she's going to be talking about today, which is creating conceptual models to enhance both the readability and clarity of your proposals, because that's one of the important keys to getting funded. So I will turn it over to Dr. Muller, who's going to take it from here. Thank you.
Much. And hello, everybody. So my name is Clemma, and you have heard a little bit about who I am. I've been working with Deidre Buchwald and Spiro Manson for 15 or 16 years now, and much of the work that I do involves grant writing. And in recent years, we have developed an approach to including conceptual models in our grant proposals that has been very successful for us. And so we developed this presentation to share these best practices with you in order for you to have the option of trying them out for inclusion in your own grants. So on this slide here, you just see a conceptual model that I found online. This isn't necessarily what I would consider a great example of a useful conceptual model for our purposes, but it's an entertaining, if slightly terrifying image. So I start with that. Okay. So as we go along, I imagine questions may occur to you as I'm speaking. In the interests of time, I encourage you to hold your questions unless you literally don't understand something I'm saying. So if you need to ask a question to clarify something that I'm saying on the slide, please feel free to type that into the chat. And oh, I'm seeing that we need more volume. I will turn up my microphone. All right, well, I'll try to keep an eye on that chat, and if it's too loud now and I need to turn it down, just let me know. Anyway, so if you have questions that have to do with clarifying literally what I'm saying, go ahead and ask those right away. Otherwise, I would encourage you to just hold your questions because I might address them in the seminar, and then at the end we'll have some time for questions. So why do you even consider including a conceptual model? Basically, we have found that including a conceptual model in most of our grant proposals seems to increase the clarity and readability of the proposal and helps us get the major award. And the longer I give this presentation, the more I realize there are not always people in the group who know what this major award refers to, which I think is a generational thing. So if you haven't seen The Christmas Story, you won't necessarily know what this means. But it's very funny for those of us who remember that movie. So how does this happen? Conceptual models do three things in my experience. One, they're study specific, and they give information specifically about your project. Two, they clarify the text. You want to have clear, concise writing, but sometimes a nice, simple visual really contributes to the impact of your proposal. And three, they guide the analysis plan, which is especially important if you're collaborating with a statistician who may or may not be an expert in your particular area of research. So much of the content for this discussion is based on an article published in 1991 by Earp and Ennett, which is available for download in the files of this seminar. And I think it's a nice paper, and I encourage you to read it. So they make a distinction in this manuscript between what I call theoretical frameworks, which are broad theory-based models that describe an entire field of research, and what I'm calling conceptual models, which are narrowly focused on what is being measured and evaluated in your particular study. So there's some definitions that I pull mostly from this article are shown here on this slide. So they define conceptual models broadly as a diagram of linkages between concepts that are relevant to your research. So for instance, in this example, this is a hypothetical example that's adapted from their paper. We might have a hypothesized cause, which is patient-doctor communication. We assert that there's a causal link between patient-doctor communication and the effect of interest, which is patient compliance with some type of treatment regimen. So in a conceptual model, you have concepts, in this case, communication and compliance, linked by arrows, and the direction of the arrow reflects the hypothesized direction of causation between those two concepts. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you're testing causation. These can apply to cross-sectional data, and we'll talk about that more later. But it reflects the underlying causal framework that you think is at play and relevant to your particular study. Conceptual model concepts should be abstract, they should be measurable, and they should be simple and concise. This is not the place to include theory, variables, or specific statistical methods. Okay. Another facet of conceptual models that is important to talk about is that you want them to be not vague, but you don't want them to be directional. So we would say patient-doctor communication has a causal effect on patient compliance. We wouldn't necessarily do what's being shown below, which is to say parse out patient-doctor communication into the specific communication score variable that we will use, and then show directionality based on certain scores that people might achieve. So we wouldn't show what's down below with directionality and variable specific terminology, but we would show what's up above, which is a more abstract representation of the causal effects that we think are at play. It's also not a study design figure that's shown here, just a general study design figure that we've used in a grant proposal that we submitted. So that's not what we're talking about here. That would be something different. Some other terminology that they talk about in the Earp article, and also there's a Kramer article that's included in these files that you can download that I think are useful, are shown on this slide. So first we have, in addition to the cause and effect that we're interested in, a mechanism or a mediating factor. So in this hypothetical example, we might think that patient understanding of the importance of the recommended treatment or just how to do it is a mechanism or a mediator that is influenced by communication and in turn influences compliance. Okay. We might also hypothesize that cultural norms, either the patient's perception of cultural norms or other ways in which cultural norms could influence our research topic, we might think that cultural norms have a causal effect on both patient-doctor communication and on patient compliance with the recommended treatment. In that case, cultural norms would be called a confounder. And then we might also hypothesize that patient understanding is an important mediator cause of patient compliance with the treatment, but that this effect of understanding on compliance depends on whether they have insurance. So they may understand perfectly well why they need this treatment and how to do it, but if they don't have the insurance to access the treatment, that may not matter, and there may not be an actual measurable effect. So people who have insurance may have a larger effect of understanding on compliance than people who don't. So in this particular presentation, I call that a modifier or an interaction. And I put these up front because I have found that in different fields, sometimes people talk about these terms slightly differently. So this is how they'll be used in this presentation. The term moderator is often used in talking about how variables relate to each other in an analysis. I steer away from that because I find that it can be confusing, especially when you have multiple fields represented in a group. It can be confusing to get clarity on exactly what people mean by moderation. Okay, so now we'll talk about how conceptual models can be integrated into a grant to improve your chances of getting funded. And we'll start with the idea that the model is study specific. So this table shows a breakdown of 4 components in what I call a comprehensive model compared to a study-specific model. So a comprehensive model is, again, what I refer to as kind of a theoretical framework, or something that's designed to summarize an entire field of study. And these are very important and very useful. And often your proposal may draw from a comprehensive model to justify your study design or your scientific questions. The concepts that you want to depict in a comprehensive model would be everything that's relevant to this particular field of research. The theory underlying this comprehensive framework would probably be included in the model. So if you're using the social ecological framework or a theory of learned behavior or whatever you're using, that would be included in a comprehensive model. The purpose of these models is typically hypothesis generating. It's rare that a comprehensive model can be tested in a single study in its entirety because there are usually far too many connections and relationships between the different concepts in the model. So generally this is published in a manuscript and serves as a hypothesis generating tool for more specific and narrowly focused studies. Usually you find these in manuscripts. You would not usually generate a new comprehensive model for a grant proposal. You would publish it in a manuscript and then reference it to justify whatever the research is that you're proposing for your study. In a study-specific model, you have, again, concepts, but you only include the concepts that you are measuring in your study. And I should mention that this particularly pertains to quantitatively oriented studies, but I think it is sometimes, but not as often, relevant to qualitative research as well. Okay, so you only want the concepts that you are measuring in your study. You don't want to put in any theory. We often reference in text the theoretical framework that we are drawing from in our study, and I'll show some examples of that, but we don't depict the theory in the conceptual model itself. The purpose of a conceptual model in a grant proposal is to clarify the study design, so that as your reviewers read through the proposal and the text description of your design and what you intend to do, they have a simple visual that they can also access to help them understand the text when they originally read it, and then also for a quick refresher if they need to glance back at it to remember exactly how different variables relate to each other. It's quicker than having them have to scan through the text again. So these are usually found in study proposals. So typically you would include this conceptual model in a proposal, but when it comes time to write the results manuscript, it would be unusual to include the specific conceptual model in that manuscript. So here are some examples of comprehensive models. I wanted to start by showing you what a conceptual model is not. And these are just pulled from the literature. All of the papers that these are pulled from are included in the files for you to look at if you would like to do so. And I don't have access to my notes on this particular presentation format, so I can't remember exactly what the name of this model was, but it was a model of a theoretical model for development and adolescent health and development, or something like that. And so what you see here is a number of different concepts, a number of different arrows, and they all point to each other in different ways. And I think that you can look at this picture and realize that it would be really tough to gather all the data that you need on a sample large enough to test all of these arrows and relationships in a single study. And that's not what this model is meant to do. This model is meant to generate hypotheses for specific research. Okay, I'm trying to sit as close as possible to my microphone, so if it's still not working well, go ahead and put that in the chat, and I'll try to keep an eye on it. Okay, here's another example of a comprehensive model. This is an effort to integrate disability into healthcare and wellness model. So again, lots of domains, lots of arrows, way too complicated to measure in a single study or analyze in a single study. Even with structural equation modeling or some of the methods that are designed to test multiple pathways at once, this would still be a pretty big monster for that type of analysis. Here's another model. This is the integrated predictive model of human behavior, or something like that. And the same thing again. So this is a comprehensive model, and it's designed to inform a specific field of study, but not necessarily a single research project. Okay, so for the rest of this proposal or this seminar, we'll be talking about study-specific models. And to get more into the details, we'll go back to that hypothetical example that I adapted from the Earp and Ennett study, where we're looking at patient-doctor communication as our primary cause of interest or independent variable. And we think that there's a causal effect on patient compliance with a specific treatment. So again, our conceptual model should include abstract concepts. So patient-doctor communication, that's fairly abstract. We're not giving any specifics. We're not saying good communication. We're not saying exactly what kind of communication we're talking about. Patient understanding and patient compliance, those are fairly abstract. Okay. Cultural norms may be an important potential confounder of patient-doctor communication and patient compliance. But it should only be in our conceptual model if it is both important and measurable, and if we are measuring it. So although cultural norms might be important, if we are not measuring those cultural norms, then that would not be something we'd want to include in our model. Okay. This is a model that is adapted directly from the Earp and Ennett paper. So they give an example of a conceptual model that you see here on the screen. So this is a study in which the researchers are interested in whether the attachment to parents experienced by youth affects their smoking behavior, the smoking behavior of the youth. They think that parental smoking, commitment to conventional activities, and beliefs in the conventional rules of society are all important variables or concepts that also need to be considered when they're doing this analysis. And here's the conceptual model they give to demonstrate these relationships. Now, to me, this particular conceptual model is pretty confusing. It doesn't really give me more clarity in how these different variables relate to each other. And I don't really personally find that this would help me understand a research study. And in fact, if I was working on a project where this was the conceptual model we had come up with, that would be a clue to me that maybe our study is too complicated. And so one of the questions I would have if I was working with people on this study is whether we should consider dropping commitment to conventional activities and belief in the conventional rules of society. So one of my questions would be, are these really important? Are they strongly related with both our exposure of interest, attachment to parents, and our outcome of interest? And then, are they being measured? Can they be measured, and are they being measured? Because if we take those out of the model, it reduces to what you see here. And that's something I can really wrap my head around as a question that's being addressed in a single research project. What is the association between attachment to parents and smoking behavior? And how does parental smoking itself modify, or is there an interaction on this causal relationship between attachment and youth smoking based on whether or not their parents smoke? And then there was one more example I just wanted to quickly give that I thought was kind of interesting that I've also included on the files that you can download. And this was sort of a hybrid example where some authors did create what they called a comprehensive model. And then they went into the literature and found, they kind of did a systematic review to actually indirectly test each of the pathways in this model. So sometimes there can be gray areas or overlap between conceptual models and theoretical frameworks. And this is an unusual example of a conceptual model that is published in a manuscript. So I put that in there so you can see how they did that if you're interested in looking at it. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how you can use a conceptual model to clarify the text of your proposal. When you're writing your text, you're going to be explaining how you think the concepts in your study relate to each other. And here is a possible list of some of the terms that we might use to explain the relationship between X and Y. And most of these, I think, should be pretty straightforward and interpretable for people who are public health scientists like yourselves. And they seem pretty clear. That's why I tried to choose terms on this list that if we read any of them, we would think that we understood what they mean, and we probably would. So X leads to Y, or X mitigates Y. Those should be pretty straightforward and easy to understand. So for this example, I'm going to focus on the statement X increases the risk of Y. So we might write in our proposal that we hypothesize that X increases the risk of Y, and that's why we're focusing on this particular relationship. That's pretty straightforward and clear. However, these four simple conceptual models show 4 different scenarios in which that statement could be true, and each of these scenarios requires a different analysis plan. So in the scenario, here's where I'm going to use my little pointer. In this scenario here, on the upper left, X directly affects Y. Z is related to Y, but not to X. This would be like a randomized controlled trial. Whereas down here, X affects Y through Z. So X still increases the risk of Y, but it does so through a mediating factor Z. These require different analytic methods. And in this one, Z is a confounder. And then down here at the bottom, X still increases the risk of Y, but in this case, X is the confounder of the Z-Y relationship. So that is one way, or that's one example of how what seems to be a pretty straightforward text sentence can be interpreted in different ways depending on the specifics of the situation, and a conceptual model can help quickly clarify exactly what you mean by that statement. Okay, so this is the slide where I depart from best practices for PowerPoint presentations, and I give you a slide with a whole lot of text, and I'm going to pause for about 30 or 40 seconds so you can read it. So this is some text I wrote that could accompany that hypothetical conceptual model that we've been talking about so far. So this is, for this text, you would pretend that I'm writing the grant and that I'm explaining in prose how we think the different relationships operate between the concepts that we're looking at in our study. So I'm going to pause for 30 seconds and give you time to read that. And if you can't finish it in 30 seconds, that's okay, because you can access this later if you would like to see it again. So go ahead and do that for 30 seconds. Okay, so hopefully you at least got through most of that paragraph. The rose-colored text on your screen was just a place where I highlighted a couple of the points where we talk about causal relationships in the text that may seem fairly straightforward, but might still be hard for reviewers to visualize in their minds just as they read the text. But in general, I would consider this to be a fairly clearly written description of how these different variables relate to each other. So there's nothing wrong with this section. But I also think that when we add in the conceptual model, it becomes easier for the reviewers to read the text and quickly grasp what we're talking about for the study. And then later on, as they get into measures or they get into the statistical analysis plan and the proposal, they can quickly look back at this conceptual model and remember how we think that these different factors are exhibiting causal influence on each other, and assess the appropriateness of our analytic plan. Okay, so here's another example of a conceptual model that I created when I was working with an investigator. This was for an R21 secondary data analysis looking at obesity and diabetes with and cardiovascular health in youth and young adults in a specific population. So as I worked with this investigator and we worked on building a conceptual model for her proposal, although obesity and diabetes were the primary causal factors of interest for this particular project, we knew that hypertension was an important covariate when you're considering obesity, diabetes, and CVD or kidney dysfunction. And so we added it to the model in our early drafts. But as we worked through this model and talked about it, it became pretty clear that having hypertension in our model didn't really help clarify the goals of our study or the analysis plan itself. It added too many arrows and we felt it added confusion. Also hypertension itself. So this prompted us to have some more discussions about hypertension and the goals of the study and the scope of the study. This was an R21, so it has to be even kind of more focused and concise than an R01. We talked about it and we realized that hypertension is, we think, still fairly rare in youth, especially even youth with obesity and diabetes. It's also not as well characterized in youth as it is in adults, so it's even harder to know what hypertension means when it's considered to be clinically present. And also it was not a factor of primary interest in this study. And so we took it out and the model simplified to what you see here. And so this is the model that we went with because we felt that this model was better at quickly conveying to our reviewers the overall goals of our research project and specifically the relationships, the primary relationships that we were testing for each specific aim. And I will show you those specific aims later in this presentation. So we do not always include every concept in our study in the conceptual model. I use the conceptual model generally to depict the primary relationships that we're looking at in the study. So again, you want the conceptual model to map back to your specific aims. You want to make sure that the relationships you depict in your specific aims are congruent with what you're showing in your conceptual model. That probably sounds very obvious, but I think as many of you may know, it's easy to have disconnect develop between the specific aims and other parts of the grant because you're doing so much revision and iteration with so many different people to write this proposal that sometimes the specific aims can kind of get revised without actually revising the text. So you want to make sure your model maps back to the specific aims. But here is here's the specific aims for this particular project, where I just for the model I just showed you. So our first aim was cross-sectional, and I wanted to show you this because of what I said earlier about how you can use these conceptual models to clarify your grant proposal, even when you're looking at cross-sectional data. So even though we are not going to establish causality or direction in our model, we still show the underlying causal effects that we think are driving the cross-sectional associations that we might observe. Okay, and then the other two aims are longitudinal, and we map each one to we match each specific aim to a certain path depicted in this conceptual model. Okay. Now we'll talk about how the conceptual model can guide the analysis. And remember, I said this is especially important if you're collaborating with a statistician or a methodologist who's not very familiar with your field of research. Okay, so this slide kind of harkens back to that earlier slide I showed with the 4 different examples of how X might increase the risk of Y. But if you have a conceptual model that's fairly simple and clearly depicts your hypothesized causal relationships between the concepts in your study, and you hand that model to your statistician along with the other content of your study design and goals, your statistician may have, it may make it easier for your statistician to write an appropriate analysis plan. So for instance, in the situation depicted at the top row where this extra factor Z is associated with Y, but not with X. This would often happen in a randomized trial where potential confounders by design have no association with the treatment because the treatment has been randomized. There's no adjustment for Z would be necessary in that analysis. However, if you have an observational situation or for some other reason expect this confounding variable Z to be causally associated with both X or Y, then your statistician would want to adjust for Z in the analysis plan. The difference between confounding and mediation is especially important for writing a good analysis plan. And it's an area that's especially easy to get wrong if your statistician is not clearly, is not fully versed in the topic and your hypothesized relationships between your concepts. So often what you might see is a variable Z being treated as a confounder when in fact you think that it's a mediator. So in this situation where Z mediates the effect of X on Y, that needs a very specific kind of analysis plan that's quite different from the analysis plan that would be appropriate for this situation where Z is a confounder of X and Y. And without a good conceptual model or a very clear understanding of these relationships for your statistician, they may inadvertently write an analysis plan that reflects confounding when in fact it should reflect mediation. And that can be very problematic for a grant proposal if your reviewers catch that. Okay? And then down at the bottom, you see interaction or a modification relationship, and that would clue your statistician into the need for an interaction analysis. Okay? And this, the importance of clarity between confounding and mediation, I really want to stress that. So what I'm showing here is a situation I encountered in a grant that I reviewed once, where in the specific aims and in the significance section, they were looking at stress and health. Those were their primary factors of interest. They thought stress affected health. And in their aims and in their significance section, they described smoking as a mediator of that relationship. So stress influences smoking, which in turn influences health. In the analysis plan, in the approach, smoking was depicted as a confounder. So they were going to simply adjust for smoking as you would if you thought it was a causal effect on stress in a confounding relationship. And that, in my experience, can be a deal breaker because if your reviewers catch that, they're going to think that there's either something wrong with your model or your whole basic premise, something wrong with your data, or that your analysis plan is inappropriate for some reason. So you want to be very careful with that. And there was not a conceptual model there was no conceptual model in this particular proposal. So this was just something I caught because I'm a methods person as I read the aims and then got into the approach. But if they had worked with a conceptual model, then that discrepancy may have been avoided. Okay. Often when I'm in the process of writing a grant with other investigators, I'll have a more complicated internal model that I use as kind of a working model and that will guide the analysis plan as we're writing it, but may be more complicated than the final model that we put into our grant proposal. And so for instance, in the model that I showed you earlier with the obesity and diabetes and CVD analysis in youth, we did keep this more complicated model kind of at the table as we wrote the grant, because in the analysis plan, we do want to explain how we're going to account for blood pressure or hypertension in the analysis. But in terms of helping reviewers understand the goals and the scientific value of our study, we didn't feel that including hypertension was useful. So we took it out for that final model. But so we frequently have an internal model that has more factors and is more complicated than what we finally put in our grant. As you're writing your own conceptual models, play around with them. So I'm giving you a long list of best practices that I have identified over the months and years that I've been writing grants. But just about everything I've said here, every rule that I've given you here, I have broken at times. And I would say to break my rules or to develop your own, your goal is always to improve clarity and make it easier for your reviewers to understand exactly what you're doing and why it's worth funding your study now. So if you need to add theory to your model and you feel that adding theory to your model really helps to give clarity and make the case for your study, then do it. So we go through many iterations of our models typically before we settle on the final version that we want to use in our proposal. So one option you could consider is to show how each specific aim maps onto your model directly. So this is a model from quite a number of years ago where we actually, for the first aim was a prevalence aim, just to look at the prevalence and kind of overall burden of the subclinical cerebrovascular disease measures. And in aim 2, we were looking at the relationships shown on the left, and in aim 3, we were looking at the relationships shown on the right. So this was something that we did that violates a number of the best practices that I've talked about, but we felt in this case that it was the best model we came up with to complement the text. Okay. You can also use shapes and shading to illustrate different roles in the analysis or different types of causal effects or to indicate targets for intervention and different types of concepts in your study. So this is a model from a project that we had funded. It was an educational intervention to improve blood pressure control in Alaska Native people with hypertension in a healthcare system in Alaska. And on the left, we have rectangles showing the targets for intervention. And in this particular mechanism, it was required to have 3 levels of intervention. So we have the individual level, the provider level, and the system level. So we show how those targets for intervention relate to each other. We were required to evaluate mechanisms or mediating factors. And so those are the diamonds in our model. So we show the diamonds and how the different targets for intervention exert a causal influence on the mediators. And in turn, we show how those particular mediators exhibit a causal influence on our outcome, which was blood pressure control in this particular population. And in this case, our conceptual model was carefully structured to map directly to required elements of the RFA. And so that is something you can also do in your conceptual model if you deem it appropriate and useful. You can use it to highlight ways in which your proposal meets requirements specified in the RFA if you're addressing a specific opportunity for funding as opposed to, say, a general unsolicited R01. Oops. Okay, and so then, sorry, this is kind of a hairline trigger to move the slides here. I wanted to give an example of how we create a conceptual model. So this is an example for a conceptual model that we used on a grant proposal that was very well scored at NCI. It didn't end up getting funded, but that actually had nothing to do with its score. So it was scored in the 6th percentile. So it was an effective proposal. And it was a behavioral intervention for colorectal cancer screening. So we started out with a theoretical framework, and we used this theory of behavior prediction by Fishbein. So we started out with a comprehensive model, and we described it in text. Okay, so this was the basis for our behavioral assumptions in the study. And here's the text that we used to describe this theory. And so I'm going to, again, depart from best practices for PowerPoint presentations and give you about 30 seconds to read this section. Okay. Okay, so here we don't try to describe the entire integrative model of behavioral prediction. We reference it, so reviewers who want to can go look it up. But it's not critical to understanding our project, so we don't present it in its entirety. We try to just summarize the parts that are most relevant to our particular study. And this is not just to save space in your proposal, it's also strategic. If you show the entire model, then you're giving reviewers this great big target for criticism of factors that might not even relate to your study. So they might end up criticizing parts that have nothing to do really with the little piece that you're looking at, other than perhaps to call into question the entire premise on which you're basing your study. Okay. So then we isolated the relevant concepts from this particular model, and those are shown in the pink square. So we were looking at some of the environmental factors that affect colorectal cancer screening, people's intentions or perceptions for screening, and then the actual screening behavior itself. And we created a study-specific model. So in this case, I departed from some of my best practices, which is another reason why I wanted to show this particular model. So the unshaded concepts relate directly to the fishbine model that I just showed you. So people's intentions around screening, the environmental factors, or in this case, specific barriers to getting screened, and how they relate to CRC, colorectal cancer screening behavior. Then the blue shaded areas show how the components of our intervention, which were twofold. One was an educational brochure, I guess threefold. We had an educational brochure that we were mailing to people. We were mailing them kits for testing, fecal occult blood testing kits with pre-addressed confidential packaging for them to return it. That would overcome barriers of cost and transportation, and we hoped barriers of kind of stigma associated with testing. And then we included a financial incentive to amplify the effects of those factors on CRC screening. So here we felt that it added clarity to show how the different parts of the study related to what we were measuring. And I just see a question that I should probably address before we move on, which is what was step 3? Step 3 was pretty quick. I went through it pretty quickly. That was isolating the relevant concepts from the theoretical framework that you're going to be using for your study, and then adapting them to the model. Okay. So then, if you go back and you look at the theoretical framework description, that was section C1. Section C2 was the conceptual model. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds to read that, but we included this text description of our conceptual model with the model that I just showed you. So go ahead and read that. Somehow So we could have just written this prose description of how we think that our intervention would function to achieve the desired outcome, but we felt that including the conceptual model added clarity and was going to make it easier for reviewers to quickly grasp what we were trying to do and how. Another example of a conceptual model is given here. It was a study that we've recently had funded related to suicide prevention in youth. So we wrote a fairly short description in text, and then we created the model that you see here to accompany the text. And just in the interest of time, I'm not going to have us move through this in great detail here. You can go back and watch the presentation and access this model in text later if you'd like to do so. But again, it's a similar situation in which we're just trying to quickly show how the different concepts in our study relate to each other, and then the model will directly inform the analysis plan later on. And here's the conceptual model explanation for the text for the model that I showed you earlier about obesity and diabetes. You can go back and access this again later. Also, I just wanted to give you some real life examples that you could access to see what we're talking about, see in action. So these are all proposals that actually went in. The first two were funded. This one was not actually funded, but it was well reviewed. Oh, since I don't have my presenter view, I have a hard time remembering some of the slides what my point was. So one thing I did want to make here as a point was that I reminded you that we took out hypertension from the model that we ultimately presented in the proposal, but we also recognize that hypertension is important, and we anticipated that reviewers might wonder why hypertension wasn't in the model. So we included in the text an acknowledgement of this and a very brief description that to assure reviewers that we would be accounting for hypertension in the analysis, but that it wasn't of primary interest. We hadn't put it in the model. And that did not get criticized in our proposal. Okay, you're going to put your conceptual model in the approach. You never would want to put it in the specific aims page because it would take up way too much space. Significance is usually about other people's research or maybe more big picture text about your own study. And it's usually not in the innovation. You also don't want to have appendices in your proposals anymore because those aren't allowed anymore and your grant will get rejected. So you're going to put your conceptual model in the approach. I usually put it around section C. Section A for me is usually an overview. Section B is preliminary studies and investigative team. And then section C starts off with the theoretical framework and conceptual model. Okay. And then the process you go through for model building, it's not linear. I'm kind of showing it as if it were a linear process here, but it's not, because writing a grant isn't linear. You start with the specific aims, but then the specific aims affects other sections, which in turn go back and affect the specific aims, and the same thing is true of the conceptual model. But in general, you would start by identifying your key concepts, and usually that list will be pretty long. No variables, no directionality, no methods, just the key concepts that you think are at play for your study. You're going to sort them by relationships, how the different variables relate to the primary causes and effects that you're interested in. Add your arrows, and then narrow the scope. Almost always when we start with a conceptual model, it's too complicated. And so then we just have to narrow it down to a feasible chunk that can be addressed in a single study. And I say nothing is sacred here because it's not uncommon for us to have to actually drop variables or kind of focus the study on variables that maybe weren't the primary interest originally, because we realize through this process of working with a conceptual model that there's something that needs to be done first before we can address the question that originally motivated the study. And then you're just going to iterate it over and over. And then you always want to do a hard copy edit when you're writing a grant proposal. And when you do that, you want to make sure that your conceptual model maps and aligns with every other section in your grant so that all the aims, the significance, and everything in the approach all match up with the relationships shown in your conceptual model. Okay. These are the readings, but those are also available for you to download directly from the seminar. And that is the end. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to have the discussion. So I don't know if Nina is going to jump in and try to moderate the questions, but I'll just.
Yeah, no, you know what? Most of the questions that we had gotten previously, you already answered, pretty much all of them. So there's, Omero has one right now, and then I'll let you take the rest. So his question was, can we have a model for each aim?
That's a really good question. So I would say yes, you certainly can. You might. So I think it depends on your study. So sometimes you have a study with specific aims that are kind of pretty separate from each other. So maybe specific aim 1 is asking a scientific question that doesn't really directly relate to specific aim 2. And so maybe they're two completely different populations or different data sets, or two quite different aspects of a scientific issue that you're trying to address. So then it might be appropriate to have separate conceptual models for each aim. The downside of doing that is it can add complexity to the review process. So just for someone to review your grant and hold 2 or more conceptual models kind of in their minds might put a higher cognitive burden on your reviewers. So you'd have to be very careful to make sure that that's really adding clarity and not just confusing things for your reviewers. Also, it just takes up more space in your proposal. So figures, they can be space saving sometimes, but they do take up real estate in your proposal. So you definitely want to try to minimize the figures. So I think certainly if it's possible to do it all in one model, I would generally try for that. But like I said, it's all about what makes your proposal clearer and more compelling. And so if you feel that multiple models achieves that goal, then I would certainly, consider adding those to your proposal. Okay, so there's a question about any special advice regarding models for qualitative studies. Yes, so we do make models for qualitative studies, and when I'm working with investigators who are proposing a primarily qualitative study, I always am creating my own conceptual model as I'm working with investigators, especially if I'm not an expert in their field, because like I said, it facilitates communication. So for qualitative studies, you still will often have hypothesized causal relationships that you're dealing with in your research. And it may just be that you're trying to get at some of those relationships with qualitative research methods, because those are just as valid and important as quantitative research methods, right? They each serve different purposes. And so I think it usually is constructive to include a conceptual model, at least in your planning process. So what are the concepts that you think are underlying whatever your question is that you're investigating, and how do they relate to each other? Whether you put that in your study proposal, again, just really depends on whether you think it's useful to help your reviewers understand what you're trying to do. But I think the conceptual model can sometimes help inform, say, the development of a facilitator guide, the types of questions you might want to ask, or also just, or it can also help identify kind of potential deficiencies in what currently exists. Often when we're doing qualitative work, it's because we're trying to translate something that was maybe developed in a dominant population for use in a smaller population or as a unique population. And sometimes working with a conceptual model can help identify deficiencies of what already exists, and give you some context and help provide information for what you're going to be doing in your qualitative research. So yes, I would still do it. If you're in a situation where you don't have causal relationships that you're working with, then it might not be meaningful. But off the top of my head, it's hard for me to think of a research study where we haven't had some type of causal relationship that we're hypothesizing that is driving the research.
So Clemma, this is Nina again from the Coordinating Center. I had a question. Are there pitfalls that faculty seem, especially junior faculty, maybe encounter as they're trying to do this? And could you maybe still say a little bit more about what people can avoid?
That's a great question. Yes. So one is really grasping the distinction between a theoretical framework and a conceptual model. So one that I see a lot is a situation where someone makes a model that has a lot of important concepts, but that they're not directly relevant. They're not part of the specific study at hand. And there's a place for that kind of information, but it generally, in my experience, doesn't strengthen a research proposal. So that's one pitfall that I do see quite a bit. If you include concepts in there that you're not addressing in your study, you may have reviewers criticize you for not addressing them, even if there's a very legitimate reason for not doing so. So that's one. Another is keeping the concepts abstract but measurable. So they're going to be abstract, but they have to be measurable. But you don't want to say how you're measuring them in your conceptual model. That happens in your measures section. So kind of navigating that balance is something that can be tricky. And my best advice is to show your proposal to as many people as possible and try to get feedback on whether this conceptual model helps clarify and improve understanding of the research proposal or whether it's causing confusion. And that can be, I think, one way to start to develop your own sort of voice for making conceptual models. But those, I think, are the big two. One is like including theory, making it too large, and the other is kind of getting study design mixed up with the conceptual model and sort of kind of integrating them in a way that doesn't really add clarity.
So you had another question there in the box about conceptual models versus frameworks, but Gina's saying you answered it. It looks like there's a couple more coming through, and those will probably be the last questions that we can answer. I don't know if you want to add anything though about
briefly in response to Gina's question, even though it got answered. The terminology I use here isn't necessarily standard out in the literature. So you may see conceptual models used to talk about what I call a theoretical framework or vice versa. So, I use them in very specific ways, but you have to really pay attention when you're reading things in the literature because they may use the same terminology differently.
So you're getting lots of
Yeah, it's nice
positive
to see you,
feedback.
Emily. It's been a long time. That's so the question is, where would the study design go? And that's a really good question. And again, it's going to depend on kind of your own preferences and best practices for writing manuscripts. What generally works for me is to put a picture of the study design itself, especially if it's an intervention study. I usually put that up in the overview of what I call section A of the approach section. So I usually start section A with an overview of I remind reviewers the goals of the study, kind of our primary measures and variables and concepts, and I describe the study design, or summarize the study design, and I give figure 1 is generally a picture of the study design. Then section B is preliminary studies and investigative team with a table for the investigative team, and section C is where I bring in the theoretical framework and the conceptual model with a figure for the conceptual model.
All right, so I want to thank Dr. Muller again very much. I think this was a very useful presentation with really specific steps, along with kind of a larger process that will help us in developing future grant proposals. I want to remind the group that she shared 2 specific articles that you can download directly from this webinar. And then just ask everybody's maybe cooperation or help for us. Our center is funded through NIA dollars, so of course they always want evaluation information. When this seminar closes, you'll be taken to a very, very short SurveyMonkey evaluation that we would greatly appreciate your completing. And as we said, we will post the webinar, a video of the webinar itself, to the RICMAR website. RICMAR, sorry, I forget my own website, but it is ricmar.ucla.edu. And there's lots more information about the RICMAR program there. So thank you again, Dr. Muller, and thanks to everyone for joining us today, as well as for completing the evaluation, which you will be coming to soon. One last question. Would you mind sharing your email?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. It's Clemma.Muller, so as you see on the screen, just with a dot in between, at wsu.edu.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I always like talking about conceptual models, so this was a nice, enjoyable little oasis of fun in my day.
Well, thank you. I can tell you have enthusiasm for it.
I'm a little odd that way. Well, best of luck, everybody, with your grant proposals. I hope you are all successful on the first try.
Agreed.